Well, hello everyone. I'm Dave Weisberger, the CEO of CoinRoutes, and it is time for our weekly recap this week in crypto. It is July 21st, 2023. And once again, despite it being the summer, we have a lot of news to cover and a couple of stories. One in particular, it's going to take a while. First, let's look at the markets. Over the last week, Bitcoin and Ether both kind of gently settled down between 4 and 5%. Realistically, to be in the same trading range, Bitcoin is still flirting with 30,000, Ether is still flirting with 1900, etc. But it's interesting to look at the rest of the market because XRP this week is up 5%, Chainlink is up 16%, Stellar Lumens is up 20%. And most of the other large alternative coins, Solana, et cetera, are down around 7% with continued fading on Litecoin and Bitcoin Cash. But it's a little bit more dispersion in the market than we're used to. So it's kind of an interesting picture. I think reality is a 5% down in Bitcoin is really not a whole lot of action. But the news this week, there's just been a lot of it. We're going to save the congressional big bill to the end because I'm going to talk a lot about that. But the first story I want to talk about is FedNow. So the Fed announced the start of the FedNow real-time payments processing plan. And effectively, it's Venmo for banks. Now, that's a little bit overstated or a little bit too tongue-in-cheek, but it's not a blockchain. It's not a central bank digital currency. It is a faster set of payment rails for banks to use. So more or less, the Federal Reserve has just joined the 21st century, but early in the 21st century. So, effectively now we have something better. But it is not a CBDC. It is not a currency in any way. It is not something that is forced upon retail. It is opt-in from the banks, and there's literally no issue from a privacy point of view yet. Because unlike a CBDC, which is programmable, which can use its programmability to evaluate and potentially block individual transactions, this is transaction agnostic. So there's lots of hysteria. It's a good step. It's not a problem. Second news story of this week, which was interesting from the point of view of Bitcoiners, is RFK Jr. Now, RFK Jr. is polling around 40% behind Biden in likely voter polls right now, even though, interestingly, in many of the initial states, he has a higher favorability rating than Biden. But his campaign does seem to be gaining some national interest. The media is trying to keep it down, and therefore it's really a wonder whether or not media-inspired polls are actually accurate, but we'll see. In any event, he's been testifying and speaking quite often lately, and while the censorship committee where he testified was actually much more interesting. From a perspective of crypto, he called for no capital gains taxes on crypto, and on Bitcoin in particular, and for allocating a portion of the US Treasury to Bitcoin to back the dollar as a hard asset, along with gold, etc. Now, this is revolutionary. And what's interesting was his reasoning on the no capital gains. His reasoning is simple. He essentially compared it to the sales tax holiday given to big internet retailers to kickstart e-commerce, because the idea was e-commerce would eventually be better, but wasn't at the time. And obviously, we know in his retrospect that turned out to be a brilliant idea, which helped the U.S. dominate in the internet era of supply chain management, everything from Amazon on down. Third news story I want to talk about is a Senate bill that is a bipartisan bill. It is a bill which effectively says that if you are operating a DeFi protocol, you have to report suspicious activity and KYC AML every one of the people who are transacting on your network, which is vastly different than what's happening in DeFi today. And I think that there will be a ton of pushback and a lot of arguments over this bill. But it's important to note that this was supported by Senator Romney in addition to Senator Warner, Senator Reid, Jack Reed, and Senator Rounds. And by being bipartisan, it does give it a much better chance to at least move forward, because it is not seen as a particular Republican issue. And we'll talk about that when we get to the House bill later. This particular one is fascinating because regulating code is hard. And arguably, many people will say code is speech and you run into First Amendment concerns, and that's already being raised. It does pose a lot of privacy concerns. At a minimum, I think that it's fascinating. My first thought was they should at least have a $10,000 threshold for this, and maybe they should focus on the fiat on and off ramps. The reality is they're concerned that stablecoins are effectively can be used for transactions, and therefore the ability to do transactions to launder through stablecoins is problematic. Now, this could be taken care of by the other bill that's being proposed, which says stablecoins have to go through be by banks, which would of course be KYC AML at the stablecoin layer, and this would be unnecessary. But all of this is going to get flushed out. What is very interesting and very controversial in this bill is in the case of protocols that have no clear owner, that are open source, they are now targeting or want to target control applications, applications that are gateway applications to use the protocols. And they're basically setting a threshold so far of having invested $25 million in the development of that application, which for large applications is not very hard to get to. For small ones, it could get there. I think that's going to be tricky to pass. I think that there's going to be a lot of challenges on it, but it is interesting, and many people are already calling it unconstitutional. So we'll see what happens with that one. But it is important. The industry needs to understand that the governments of the world are not going to allow major financial transactional hubs to ignore anti-money laundering concerns and ignore customer suitability concerns. They're not going to allow that to happen. So what there is going to be is some notion of KYC and AML into DeFi. It may be at the wallet level. It may be at other levels. I don't know. There needs to be, however, some sort of financial privacy. Like we expect that for cash. And right now, cash transactions only have to be reported over $10,000. So at a bare minimum, we should expect that. What's interesting is the fourth news story of the week is that Coin Center's case objecting to the rules that say if it's over $10,000, that every transaction has to be reported. And it seems pretty clear that I don't know if they'll appeal it. I don't know what will happen at the circuit level, the Supreme Court level, but it's pretty clear that there are going to be battle lines drawn. And at some point, we're going to end up with an equivalence between crypto and cash. And we'll see where that is. With inflation and the cash rules at 10,000 been around for a very long time. That's been a creeping, lowering of that threshold. So I don't know what's going to occur, but there are definite real issues between privacy and anti-money laundering, and we're going to be fighting these issues for quite some time. And the fifth story is almost amusing. Gary Gensler went to the Appropriations Committee, and there's been some interesting viral memes about how he was grilled about FTX on that committee. All of that is a sideshow. The reality is he's still asked for significant increases in an enforcement budget, despite having his head handed to him by not just the courts, where he's been slapped down at least verbally in the Grayscale case. We'll see where that goes. He was certainly slapped down by Judge Torres in the XRP case in terms of the enforcement against secondary trading, which bodes well for him being slapped down in the Coinbase case. But he's been getting slapped down by multiple members of Congress. And as we talk about in a second with the most important news story of the week, which is the Agriculture Committee bill, he's being slapped down there because people recognize that that regulation by enforcement is absolutely stupid. It is a terrible policy that is guaranteed to drive viable businesses offshore and help bad businesses and fraudsters take root because they won't theoretically be under U.S. regulatory domain. So it's completely counterproductive and it does no good. Yet he keeps asking for money. Go figure. I can't understand it. Okay, let's talk about the most important story of the week, which is the Agriculture Committee release of the joint bill and the text of that bill from them and the Finance Committee. Now, I could talk for hours about this, but let's talk about what it does, because it is absolutely groundbreaking in a variety of ways. The first way it's groundbreaking is it makes it very clear that there's a difference between funding a project and secondary trading. And that's exactly what Judge Torres did. And they actually incorporated some of her logic into the final draft and into some of the verbiage around the bill. It creates a pathway to secondary trading, however. It creates a pathway for people who are not accredited investors to be usable for blockchain projects. And I've talked about that a lot. That is incredibly important. In this particular first version of the bill, they say something about not being able to invest more than 10% of one's net worth or 10% of one's income. I'm not sure if it's ever as larger or smaller, but at least it's a start. It is a way to allow tokens to incentivize open source projects. And that is something that deserves a loud cheer, regardless of where it ultimately ends up. The other thing that it does in the rulemaking is it makes crystal clear no regulation by enforcement. It, in fact, provides safe harbors for people who want to come in. It says if you want to fund up to $75 million, you can apply for, what is this safe harbor as you're getting your business plan. And basically, it essentially says you can't do it anonymously and you have to have a business plan. And pretty much that's it. And then it talks about ways of disclosures and improvements on disclosures, and that the regulators need to have those rules for things such as supply and token economics, etc. All things that are lacking in the current law. And that is a very big step forward. Lastly, it spends a lot of time focusing on how to define decentralization. Now, whether you agree with it or not, it is really a good idea to define what is decentralized or what isn't. And it is a good idea to try to get some clarity. But what is important about this bill is it still, like many other congressional bills, gives the authority to the SEC and the CFTC to write rules. So this is not an easy one and done fight, but it certainly is incredibly productive in the sense that it's charting a direction away from regulation by enforcement and to regulation by rule. And that is what is needed because, as we've said many times, and I will tell you all the time, CoinRoutes and myself personally are steadfastly in favor of intelligent, thoughtful regulation that work with the technology to protect investors, to ring fence assets, to enforce fiduciary responsibilities, to enforce marketing being fair and reasonable and not hyperbolic, and to punish people who lie. Honestly, fraud, but making them have to state things is the same as lying. If you don't disclose that there's a huge amount of supply owned by the people that invested in the first round that's coming due, well, that's something that investors need to know. So there's lots of things that people kind of errors of omission or commission. But there's a second thing that's worth talking about in this particular rule. They also took the step of preempting the dumb arguments that are going to come against it. That's interesting. And it was a document that they called the myths surrounding the bill. And there were 9 things they illustrated as myths, which they proceeded to systematically debunk with evidence in a preemptive manner. The first one, all digital assets other than Bitcoin or securities, they debunked it. The second, digital assets facilitate crime. So we shouldn't legitimize digital assets by having these rules. They debunked that, and quite thoroughly, I might add. The third, that existing legal frameworks can work. That one, as I've said multiple times, is complete unadulterated horseshit. But yet there are people who insist on continuing to state that. And those people, by the way, are chicken, because I have Mr. Stark, being the biggest, most obvious one, John Reed Stark, who I have challenged to debate multiple times, including again this afternoon, refused to do so in a moderated fashion. Of course he won't, because he'll look rather foolish, because obviously there is no way that is true. The fourth, that they in the Congress are trying to prevent good regulation by putting something that's going to help the industry and hurt consumers, and they debunked that. They talked about that the bill is purely partisan. It shouldn't be, and it isn't. They talked about digital assets as a myth. People say it has no use cases. It's the same as a spreadsheet. Well, that's complete nonsense. And none of those people will ever stand up to rigorous debate. And they preempted that and explained multiple reasons why that's not true. They said that the argument that the digital asset industry is going toward oblivion anyway, they made that one look foolish. It's not going to oblivion. It's just leaving the United States and dragging tens of thousands and ultimately potentially trillions of dollars of GDP out the door to other countries. And that's not the same thing as fading away to irrelevancy. And lastly, they debunked the notion the CFTC doesn't have the ability to actually regulate these things. And I think that all of their points are very good. But within hours, I was actually about to start recording this, there was a ludicrous tweet from the Democrats on the Agriculture Committee, right on schedule, basically saying, we think that this was a bad waste of time. You should, instead of doing this and giving a handout to Wall Street and the crypto industry, you should be spending your time on the Farm Bill. Well, I have 2 points that I would like to make there. First, if they can't walk and chew gum at the same time, If they can't do farm regulation and financial regulation since they're oversight of the CFTC, then just give up the CFTC oversight. Let it all go to the Finance Committee, and the Finance Committee within minutes will combine the CFTC and the SEC, and the US will no longer be the only country in the civilized world with two regulators. Every other country only has one. And the reason we all have two is because the people on the Act Committee want the donations that go along with oversight of the CFTC. Well, you can't get the money for your campaign, people, if you're not willing to do the work to regulate. And there's a brand new industry which has tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of people working on it around the world that actually, according to no less an august personality as the CEO of the world's largest asset manager, saying will revolutionize finance. It can happen without new rules. So to say that we need to work on farm subsidies instead is absurd. But the second thing that was absurd is they cited some random professor, a law professor, and a thread that has literally almost every argument she makes in that thread was preempted by this bill and by what they said. And so rather than go point by point, maybe they should have responded to the preemption of those arguments instead of rehashing the same nonsense that Bitcoin doesn't have a use case. It's all used for crime, yada, yada, yada. In short, do your homework. It's one thing to be obstreperous. It's another to be obstreperous and lazy. And that's what we had here by this particular tweet. My guess is it was an intern working somewhere in the, on the committee that said, oh, let's get this out here because we could say something, as opposed to let's get down to the serious business of lawmaking, something that you are actually voted into office to do by your constituents, because this should not be a partisan issue under any circumstances. And look, let's be clear. It's not only Republicans. We have Democrats. I mean, I pointed out Richie Torres and others. But if you effectively took away the funding concerns that come from the centralized Democratic National Committee, I suspect quite a few Democrats would sign on to what this is. And to be blunt, I don't understand why Democrats want to cede this to the Republicans in the upcoming elections. I just don't get it, because the reality is there's no reason that this should be a Republican issue. Bitcoin, for example, is more inclusive a financial asset than anything else that we have. So why would they do this? I don't know. But at the end of the day, the fact that we now have bills with Loomis Gillibrand, which we talked about last week, and this bill in the House going to markups means that the national conversation has been elevated up a notch. And the fact that there is universal disdain against regulation by enforcement now, and we're talking multiple Democrats, multiple Republicans have sent letters to Chair Gensler about this. It is obviously a dumb policy. So if we get down to the business of regulating in a thoughtful manner, everybody wins. I don't know why it's partisan, but at least we have this step forward. And having this come out is something that I refuse to be pessimistic about. I'm going to be optimistic and see the glass as at least a quarter full, if not half full at this point. So with that, have a great weekend and stay safe out there.